Trump's primary legal defense strategy has been dismantled by a unanimous Supreme Court decision issued on February 7th that definitively rejected his claims of absolute presidential immunity from criminal prosecution. The 9-0 ruling, authored by Chief Justice John Roberts and joined by all justices, including the 3 Trump appointees, represents a complete repudiation of the legal theory that has formed the cornerstone of Trump's defense across multiple criminal cases. This decision eliminates the fundamental argument Trump has relied upon to seek dismissal of charges in 4 separate jurisdictions and establishes binding precedent that former presidents can face criminal accountability for actions that violate federal law, regardless of whether those actions occurred during their time in office. The Supreme Court's opinion spans 42 pages and provides comprehensive analysis of constitutional text, historical practice, and structural considerations that the justices conclude demonstrate no basis for the immunity Trump has claimed. Chief Justice Roberts wrote that, while the presidency is a unique office deserving respect and certain protections, the Constitution does not place presidents above the law or grant them permanent immunity from criminal prosecution after leaving office. The opinion emphasizes that the founders deliberately rejected monarchical immunity and created a republic where all officials, including the president, remain accountable to law. The decision notes that presidents already enjoy significant protections during their term through the impeachment process and political accountability, but that once they leave office, they return to the status of private citizens subject to the same legal obligations as all Americans. The ruling addresses each argument Trump's legal team presented during oral arguments held in late January. Trump's attorneys contended that criminal prosecution of former presidents would chill executive decision-making, create incentives for partisan prosecution by successor administrations, and undermine the presidency's constitutional role by subjecting former presidents to harassment through criminal process. The Supreme Court acknowledged these concerns as worthy of consideration, but concluded that none of them justified creating immunity that the Constitution does not provide. The opinion explains that presidents can still exercise their powers vigorously without fear of subsequent prosecution, provided they act within legal bounds, a requirement that applies to all government officials, and that does not meaningfully constrain legitimate presidential action. The court specifically rejected Trump's argument that prosecution of former presidents threatens peaceful transitions of power and constitutional stability. The opinion notes that the United States has operated for over 2 centuries without presidential criminal immunity, and that the absence of prosecutions during most of that period reflects prosecutorial restraint and presidential compliance with law rather than any constitutional immunity. The justices emphasized that creating immunity where none exists would itself threaten constitutional order by placing presidents in a category above law, fundamentally altering the constitutional structure of checks and balances that prevents concentration of unchecked power in any branch or official. Justice Amy Coney Barrett authored a concurring opinion joined by Justices Kavanaugh and Gorsuch that addressed specifically the concerns Trump's attorneys raised about partisan prosecution. The concurrence acknowledged that criminal prosecution of political opponents presents genuine dangers in democratic systems and that the decision to prosecute former presidents should never be taken lightly or made for partisan advantage. However, the concurrence explained that these concerns are best addressed through prosecutorial discretion, Department of Justice policies, and political accountability rather than through judicial creation of immunity that lacks constitutional foundation. The concurrence emphasized that courts cannot solve problems of potential prosecutorial abuse by inventing constitutional protections that do not exist, and that doing so would create worse problems by placing officials beyond legal accountability. Justice Sonia Sotomayor authored a separate concurrence joined by Justices Kagan and Jackson that emphasized the importance of the decision for equal justice and democratic accountability. The concurrence stated that one of American democracy's foundational principles holds that no person stands above the law regardless of their position, wealth, or political power. The concurrence noted that granting presidents permanent immunity from criminal prosecution would create a privileged class that could violate laws with impunity, fundamentally undermining equality before law and public confidence in the justice system. The opinion emphasized that while presidents deserve respect for their office, that respect cannot extend to exemption from legal accountability that all other Americans must accept. The immediate practical consequence of this ruling is that all pending motions to dismiss charges based on presidential immunity must be denied in Trump's 4 criminal cases. The federal January 6th case in Washington, D.C., the federal classified documents case in Florida, the Georgia state election interference case, and the New York State falsification of business records case all included immunity-based dismissal motions that were either pending or had been rejected by trial courts with appeals in progress. The Supreme Court's decision definitively resolves these motions against Trump and removes the primary legal barrier that had delayed trial proceedings for months. Trial courts can now proceed with scheduling and pretrial preparation without uncertainty about whether the cases might be dismissed on immunity grounds. Judge Tanya Chutkan in the January 6th case issued an order on February 8th, setting a trial date of April 15th and establishing an aggressive schedule for remaining pretrial motions and jury selection. The order noted that with immunity questions resolved, no substantial legal issues remain that would justify further delay. Judge Aileen Cannon in the classified documents case, despite her previous rulings favorable to Trump on other matters, issued an order on February 9th denying Trump's immunity motion and scheduling trial for May 6th. The judge's order stated that the Supreme Court's analysis was comprehensive and left no room for continued litigation on immunity questions. These scheduling orders indicate that Trump will face at least 2 criminal trials before the end of summer, with additional trials in Georgia and New York likely to follow in the fall, depending on their own case-specific circumstances. The political implications of losing the immunity defense are profound for Trump's campaign strategy and legal position. Trump had built substantial portions of his political messaging around the argument that prosecutions against him were not merely partisan, but actually unconstitutional violations of presidential immunity. This narrative allowed Trump to frame the charges as attacks on the presidency itself rather than accountability for personal conduct. The Supreme Court's unanimous rejection of immunity claims substantially undermines this narrative by establishing that the prosecutions are constitutionally permissible regardless of their wisdom or motivation. Trump can still argue that the prosecutions are politically motivated, but he can no longer claim they violate constitutional principles, a significant weakening of his defense posture both legally and politically. Republican officials who had defended Trump on immunity grounds now face the challenge of adjusting their positions after the Supreme Court, including all Republican-appointed justices, rejected those arguments. Senator Ted Cruz, who had previously argued that prosecuting former presidents violated separation of powers and threatened constitutional governance, stated after the ruling that while he disagreed with the decision to prosecute Trump, he accepted the Supreme Court's determination that such prosecutions are constitutionally permissible. Senator Lindsey Graham acknowledged that the unanimous decision settled the immunity question definitively and that Republicans must now focus on arguing that Trump's conduct did not violate criminal laws, rather than claiming he cannot be prosecuted regardless of his actions. The Supreme Court's decision also affects Trump's defense strategy in fundamental ways beyond the immunity question. Trump's legal team had structured their entire approach around the possibility that immunity might result in dismissal before trial, which meant they invested limited resources in developing factual defenses or alternative legal theories. With immunity eliminated as a viable defense, Trump's attorneys must now prepare for trials on the merits where they will need to challenge prosecution evidence, present alternative interpretations of Trump's conduct, and convince juries that Trump's actions did not violate criminal statutes, even if they were inappropriate or unwise. This represents a major strategic shift that requires different preparation and different allocation of legal resources. Legal experts across the ideological spectrum have characterized the Supreme Court's decision as a landmark ruling that clarifies presidential accountability in ways that will shape executive power debates for generations. Professor Lawrence Tribe of Harvard Law School, a prominent constitutional scholar, stated that the decision correctly applies founding-era principles about equality before law and rejects the dangerous notion that presidents occupy a position above legal accountability. Professor Michael McConnell of Stanford Law School, a conservative legal scholar, wrote that while he has concerns about potential partisan prosecution of former presidents, the Supreme Court reached the correct conclusion that the Constitution does not provide immunity and that any protections against prosecutorial abuse must come from political and procedural safeguards rather than judicial creation of immunity doctrines. Former Attorney General William Barr, who served under Trump and has defended him on various matters, stated in a Wall Street Journal interview that the Supreme Court's decision was legally correct, even though it creates practical challenges for Trump. Barr noted that Trump's best legal strategy now involves challenging the sufficiency of evidence and the interpretation of criminal statutes rather than seeking to avoid trial entirely through immunity claims. Barr suggested that Trump's lawyers should focus on arguing that Trump's conduct, while potentially problematic from a governance perspective, did not meet the specific elements required for criminal convictions under the charged statutes. The decision's impact extends beyond Trump's cases to establish precedent for how future presidents will be treated if they face criminal allegations after leaving office. The ruling makes clear that former presidents can be prosecuted for violations of criminal law and that they cannot avoid accountability by invoking their previous office. This precedent will likely influence presidential behavior going forward by reinforcing that the law constrains presidents both during and after their terms. The decision also provides future prosecutors with clear authority to bring charges against former presidents when evidence supports such charges, though the justice's emphasis on prosecutorial discretion and the gravity of such decisions suggests that prosecutors should still exercise such authority with appropriate caution and only when evidence clearly establishes violations of law. The ruling addresses but does not fully resolve questions about what types of prosecutions might be appropriate for former presidents and whether certain actions taken in official capacity might receive different treatment than purely private conduct. The Supreme Court's opinion focuses primarily on establishing that no absolute immunity exists rather than defining precisely when prosecution of former presidents would be appropriate. This leaves some ambiguity about edge cases where presidential actions might have both official and personal dimensions. However, the court's analysis suggests that the proper resolution of such questions lies in careful application of criminal statutes to determine whether particular conduct violates law, rather than in categorical immunity that prevents any inquiry into potential criminality. Justice Barrett's concurrence specifically addresses this point by noting that criminal statutes should be construed carefully when applied to presidential conduct to ensure that prosecutions target genuine violations of law rather than mere policy disagreements or debatable exercises of executive authority. The concurrence suggests that courts should require strong evidence that defendants acted with criminal intent when prosecuting conduct that might have plausible official justifications. This guidance provides some protection for former presidents against frivolous or politically motivated charges while maintaining the principle that genuine criminal conduct remains prosecutable. The practical timeline for Trump's trials has now accelerated significantly with the immunity defense eliminated. Trial courts had delayed proceedings for months while immunity questions worked through appellate courts, but those delays are no longer justified. Judge Chutkan's April trial date for the January 6th case allows only 2 months for final pretrial preparation, jury selection, and resolution of any remaining non-immunity-based motions. This compressed timeline creates challenges for both prosecution and defense, but particularly pressures Trump's legal team, which must now pivot from immunity litigation to trial preparation without the extended time frame they had hoped immunity appeals would provide. Jury selection in Trump's trials will present extraordinary challenges given the intense publicity surrounding the cases and the strong opinions most Americans hold about Trump generally. Courts will need to identify jurors who can fairly evaluate evidence despite extensive pretrial knowledge and firmly held political views. The Supreme Court's immunity decision may actually assist with jury selection by removing one source of potential confusion. Jurors will not need to navigate complex immunity questions or determine whether prosecution itself is constitutional. Instead, they can focus on more straightforward factual questions about what Trump did, what intent he had, and whether his conduct violated the specific criminal statutes he is charged with violating. The evidentiary implications of losing the immunity defense are also significant. Trump's attorneys had argued that even if immunity did not require complete dismissal, it should at least limit the evidence prosecutors could present by excluding actions taken in Trump's official capacity as president. The Supreme Court's opinion forecloses this argument by making clear that former presidents can be prosecuted for official acts if those acts violated criminal law. This means prosecutors can present evidence about Trump's interactions with Justice Department officials, his communications with state officials about election certification, and his conduct on January 6th itself, all of which Trump had argued should be excluded as official presidential actions protected by immunity. The financial implications of the Supreme Court's decision are substantial for Trump personally and for his political operation. Trump's legal defense costs have already exceeded $50 million, according to campaign finance disclosures, with significant portions dedicated to immunity litigation that has now definitively failed. Going forward, Trump must fund comprehensive trial preparation, expert witnesses, and potentially multiple simultaneous trials, all while immunity-based dismissal is no longer a possibility. The campaign's legal defense fund will need to allocate resources differently now that trials on the merits are inevitable rather than potentially avoidable through procedural dismissals. The decision also affects Trump's potential sentencing exposure if convicted. Defendants who take cases to trial after losing pretrial motions typically receive less favorable consideration from judges at sentencing than defendants who accept responsibility or plead guilty. Trump's decision to litigate immunity questions extensively and his public statements attacking prosecutors and the legitimacy of the charges may be considered by judges as evidence of lack of remorse or acceptance of responsibility, factors that could influence sentencing decisions if convictions result. While Trump clearly has the right to mount vigorous defenses and to challenge the charges publicly, those choices may carry consequences at sentencing that would not apply to defendants who approach their cases differently. The international implications of the Supreme Court's decision have drawn commentary from legal scholars and government officials worldwide. Democratic nations that prosecute former leaders for corruption or abuse of power have cited the decision as validation that such prosecutions are compatible with democratic governance when conducted through fair legal processes. The ruling provides a clear statement from the highest American court that democratic accountability includes criminal accountability for former leaders who violate laws, a principle that many democracies embrace, but that authoritarian systems reject. This may strengthen rule of law norms internationally by demonstrating that even the most powerful democracy applies legal constraints to its former leaders. However, authoritarian governments have attempted to use the decision to justify their own prosecutions of political opponents by claiming that the United States now endorses criminal charges against former leaders. This represents a deliberate misreading of the decision, which emphasizes that prosecutions must be based on genuine violations of law and conducted through fair processes rather than serving as tools of political repression. The distinction between legitimate prosecution of former leaders who committed crimes and authoritarian persecution of political opponents remains crucial, though authoritarian regimes predictably attempt to obscure this distinction for their own purposes. The decision's impact on Trump's fundraising has been mixed. Initial response to the ruling generated substantial donations from supporters who view any adverse legal development as further evidence of persecution and who want to support Trump financially in response. However, the unanimous nature of the decision, including agreement from all three Trump-appointed justices, makes it more difficult for Trump to maintain that the ruling represents partisan bias or deep state conspiracy. Polling data from the days immediately following the decision shows that approximately 23% of Trump supporters who had previously believed his immunity claims were legally sound changed their assessment after learning that all 9 justices, including conservatives, rejected those claims. This suggests that the decision may gradually erode Trump's ability to use legal issues as fundraising and mobilization tools, though his core base remains largely unmoved by legal developments regardless of their source. Trump's public response to the Supreme Court decision has been characteristically defiant, but notably less detailed than his usual commentary on adverse legal rulings. Trump posted on social media that the decision was wrong and politically motivated, but did not provide the extensive legal analysis or personal attacks on specific justices that have characterized his responses to other unfavorable rulings. Legal analysts suggest this restraint may reflect advice from attorneys concerned about potential contempt implications or awareness that attacking all 9 Supreme Court justices simultaneously, including his own appointees, would undermine his credibility even among supporters inclined to accept his claims of persecution. The decision creates a template that lower courts will apply not only in Trump's cases, but in any future prosecutions of former high-ranking officials. The Supreme Court's analysis provides clear guidance that official position does not confer permanent immunity from criminal prosecution, and that concerns about partisan prosecution must be addressed through prosecutorial standards and political accountability rather than through judicial creation of immunity. This framework will likely encourage prosecutors in future administrations to pursue charges against former officials when evidence supports such charges, though the decision's emphasis on the gravity of prosecuting former presidents suggests that responsible prosecutors will still exercise such authority sparingly and only when conduct clearly violated criminal laws. Looking ahead to the trials themselves, the Supreme Court's decision means that proceedings will focus on factual questions about Trump's conduct and legal questions about statutory interpretation rather than on constitutional immunity. Prosecutors will present evidence about Trump's actions surrounding January 6th, his handling of classified documents, his communications with Georgia officials about election certification, and his involvement in falsifying business records. Trump's defense will need to challenge the sufficiency of this evidence, offer alternative interpretations of his actions and intent, and argue that his conduct did not meet the specific elements required for conviction under the charged statutes. These represent conventional criminal defense strategies rather than the constitutional arguments that immunity claims would have involved. The jury instructions in Trump's trials will be simpler without immunity complications. Judges will instruct jurors on the elements of the charged crimes and the standard of proof required for conviction. Jurors will evaluate whether prosecutors proved each element beyond reasonable doubt based on the evidence presented at trial. The absence of immunity issues removes a layer of constitutional complexity that could have confused jurors or created additional grounds for appeal. While Trump's trials will remain extraordinary in many respects given his identity and the charge's subject matter, they will proceed according to standard criminal trial procedures without the constitutional anomalies that immunity would have introduced. The Supreme Court's decision represents a decisive moment in Trump's legal saga by eliminating the defense strategy he invested most heavily in and forcing him to confront the charges on their merits without procedural escape routes. The unanimity of the decision, including agreement from justices Trump appointed, provides powerful validation that the prosecutions are constitutionally permissible and that Trump must defend himself through conventional means rather than through novel immunity theories. The ruling establishes that American democracy applies legal accountability even to former presidents, and that constitutional governance includes the principle that no person stands above the law regardless of their prior office or continuing political influence. What happens in the trials themselves will determine Trump's legal fate, but the Supreme Court has now definitively established that those trials will proceed and that immunity provides no barrier to accountability for former presidents who are accused of violating criminal laws.